He did not shake my hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that does not belong in his space, briefly, deliberately, with just enough pause to make sure everyone at the table saw it. Then he said, "Save that for uneducated people like you." And the room went so quiet I could hear the candle between us. My name is Tressie Pickett. And that was the night everything changed. I had dressed carefully. Not to impress. I stopped dressing to impress people a long time ago. I dressed because this dinner mattered to my son, and anything that matters to Harlan matters to me. I wore the navy dress I keep for occasions that require dignity rather than performance. Low heels, simple earrings. And before I closed the top drawer of my dresser, I reached past my good jewelry and picked up Wendell's watch. It is a man's watch, wide-faced, heavy, the leather strap worn soft from years on his wrist. I do not wear it often. I wore it that night because I wanted him in the room with me. I had no way of knowing how much I would need him there. The restaurant was in Buckhead, private dining room, the kind with no prices on anything because the people who eat there do not ask. Sterling Smith had chosen it, which told me something before he opened his mouth. A man who selects a room to remind other people where they stand is a man who needs them to feel smaller. I noted that. I noted the way he performed for the waiter, not rudeness, something more deliberate than rudeness. Warmth deployed like a tool, switched off the moment the waiter stepped back. I noted the way Celine Smith held her wine glass without drinking from it, eyes moving across her husband the way you watch something you have long since stopped trusting. And I noted Lacey, their daughter, my son's fiancée, whose hands stayed folded in her lap the entire first course, still in the particular way of someone who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. Harlan sat beside me. He was at ease in the way only people with clear consciences are at ease. He talked about the firm, about Atlanta, about something that made Lacey smile with her whole face. I watched him and felt the specific pride a mother carries quietly, so it does not embarrass her child. If you are watching this late at night or on a slow Sunday morning, go ahead and tell me in the comments. I want to know where you are and what time brought you here. The food came. Conversation moved. Sterling held the table the way men like him always hold tables, not by saying the most interesting thing, but by making it understood that the conversation exists on his terms. I ate. I listened. I did not perform. Then the main course was cleared. I turned to Sterling Smith and extended my hand properly, the way my mother taught me, the way I have greeted every person worth greeting in my 61 years. He looked at my hand, then at my face, then at my dress. The pause lasted exactly long enough to be intentional. Save that for uneducated people like you. Celine's glass touched the table. Lacey's hands unfolded. I felt Wendell's watch against my wrist. Cool, steady, present, and I did not move. I did not pull my hand back. I held it there one full breath longer before I lowered it myself. Then Harlan stood up. His chair did not scrape. He rose the way his father used to rise, unhurried, completely certain, and his hand closed around my arm just above the elbow. He looked at Sterling Smith across that candlelit table and said something in a register I had never heard from my son before. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that knew exactly what it was saying. Harlan did not raise his voice. That was the thing that stayed with me the whole drive home. Not the words themselves, but the complete absence of heat behind them. He looked at Sterling Smith across that table and said, "You have just made the biggest mistake of your life, Mr. Smith." Then he picked up my coat from the back of my chair, placed it around my shoulders, and walked me out of that room like we had simply finished our meal. Nobody followed us. The drive back through Atlanta was almost silent. I watched the city through the passenger window, Buckhead giving way to the quieter streets I have known for 30 years. and I did not ask Harlan to explain himself. There was nothing to explain. What he said was not a threat. It was a fact delivered to a man who did not yet have the information to understand it. That distinction mattered. Harlan drove the way Wendell used to drive, both hands, unhurried, eyes forward. He did not check on me. He did not ask if I was all right. He understood that I was not all right and that asking would have made it smaller than it was. That is his father in him. That has always been his father in him. We got home just past 9. I put my purse on the hall table. Harlan went to the kitchen and I heard him fill the kettle without being asked. I sat down at the table and unclasped Wendell's watch and set it in front of me. I did not put it away. I just needed it where I could see it. Harlan sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Do you remember the Hargrove instrument?" I looked up. Of course I remembered it. Not every detail, not every amendment. But I remembered what it was. Wendell had spent years treating it as something important enough to review carefully and ordinary enough not to discuss dramatically. Harlan nodded when I answered. Then he began laying out the pieces. Not everything, just enough. The original Hargrove Capital Agreement had been drafted 14 years earlier when the Smith Company needed outside stability. Wendell had structured it himself. Certain protections had been built into it. Certain rights had been preserved. Rights that had never needed to be exercised until now. The kettle began to whistle softly in the kitchen. Neither of us moved. Harlan continued. He explained what the relationship looked like today. Not dependency in the dramatic sense. Nothing so simple. Something more subtle and therefore more important. A long-standing capital position that had become part of the company's foundation over time. He explained that most people inside the Smith organization knew Hargrove Capital existed. What they did not know was who sat behind it. Not because it was hidden, because it had never mattered enough for anyone to ask. I listened without interrupting. There is a kind of conversation that does not need your reaction in the middle of it. It needs your full attention at the end. This was that kind of conversation. When he finished, I said, "Sterling Smith does not know any of this." Harlan leaned back slightly. "No," he said. "He knows Hargrove Capital. His board knows Hargrove Capital. Their lawyers certainly know Hargrove Capital." A faint pause. But to him, it's an institution, a name on documents, a relationship that's always been there. He looked down at Wendell's watch. He doesn't know who's making the decisions. The kettle had gone quiet. Neither of us moved to pour it. I looked at the watch resting between us. 14 years ago, Wendell had sat in a room with Sterling Smith's people and structured a rescue they were grateful for. He had never needed them to know his wife would eventually manage it after he was gone. He did not build things that required an audience. Neither do I. Harlan reached into the folder he had carried in from the car and slid a single document across the table toward me. The original instrument. My name was not on it. Wendell's trust was. But every decision made against it for the past 6 years had been mine. He said, "The decision is yours alone, Mama. I will not raise it again unless you do." He left the document on the table and got up to pour the tea. Harlan left just after 10. I heard his car back out of the driveway, and then there was nothing but the house. The particular quiet of a home that has held one person for several years, and learned to settle around her. I did not move the document from the table. I changed out of my good dress, hung it carefully, and came back downstairs in my housecoat. I poured the tea Harlan had made and sat back down in the same chair. Then I pulled the document toward me and began to read it the way you read something you already know. Not for information, but for confirmation of what you are about to do with it. Wendell drafted the Hargrove instrument 14 years ago when the Smith Company was in genuine trouble. A restructuring had failed. 2 institutional lenders had pulled back within the same quarter. Sterling Smith's people came to Wendell quietly. The way people only come to you when they have already exhausted the options they preferred. Wendell structured the entry as a rescue. Patient capital, long horizon, covenant protections that were generous enough to make the deal attractive and precise enough to make certain they could never be ignored. He was not trying to trap anyone. He was trying to build something that would last. That was how Wendell did everything. The covenant breach clause was on page 11. I have read it enough times that I could find it with my eyes half closed. It was written in plain language because Wendell did not trust agreements that hid their meaning in complexity. If the company materially misrepresented its governance, its capital structure, or its treatment of investor interests, in any form, in any setting, the managing partner of Hargrove Capital held the right to initiate a full withdrawal on 90 days' notice. Clean, legal, unambiguous. I turned to the amendment page at the back. 4 years ago, the Smith Company had attempted a quiet restructuring, a refinancing arrangement that would have effectively subordinated the Hargrove position without triggering a formal consent requirement. Their counsel had been careful. Most people reviewing it would have missed what it did. I had not missed it. I had sat at this same kitchen table with the original instrument and the proposed amendment side by side, and I had found the clause they were working around. I sent a single letter through a registered agent. The restructuring did not proceed. That decision had been mine. Not Wendell's direction, not a lawyer's advice. Mine. I set the document down and held my tea with both hands. The word came back to me the way it had been coming back all evening. Not loudly, just steadily. The way water finds the same low point no matter how many times you redirect it. Uneducated. Sterling Smith had looked at my dress and my extended hand and my 61 years, and he had reached for the word he believed would be most reducing. He had no way of knowing that the woman he said it to had spent 14 years reading documents like the one on her kitchen table, making decisions that kept his company solvent, and never once needed anyone in that Buckhead dining room to know her name. I thought about Wendell, not with grief, with something steadier than grief. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. He had taught me by doing it beside me until I could do it alone. He had never once suggested I was anything less than capable of every room he walked me into. I sat with that for a long time. Then my phone moved on the table. I looked at the screen. The name stopped me completely. Not because I expected hostility, but because I did not expect this at all. Lacey Smith. I let it ring once more. Then I answered. Her voice was careful, controlled, the voice of someone who had rehearsed the first sentence. She was not calling to apologize for her father. She asked if she could come over. She arrived at 10:30 the following morning in a car she parked 2 houses down, which told me something before she knocked. A woman who parks 2 houses down is a woman who is not certain she should be here at all, and came anyway. I opened the door before she knocked twice. She was dressed plainly, no jewelry, hair pulled back. She looked like her mother around the eyes, and nothing like her mother anywhere else. I stepped back and let her in. She sat on the edge of the sofa the way people sit when they are not planning to stay long and then end up staying. I brought 2 cups of coffee she did not ask for and set one in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at the table for a moment before she looked at me. She said, "I'm not here to explain him." I said, "I know." What Lacey told me over the next 40 minutes was not a confession and not a defense. It was a pattern, delivered in the flat, precise tone of someone who has had years to observe something and no safe place to say it out loud until now. Sterling Smith had built his career on a specific technique. In any room where he felt his position needed reinforcing, he identified the person least likely to retaliate and diminished them publicly, cleanly, with just enough social cover that it read as candor rather than cruelty. It made the room recalibrate around him. It made any response from the diminished party look like wounded pride. He had done it in boardrooms to junior partners. He had done it at charity tables to people who needed his endorsement. He had done it at family gatherings to anyone Lacey brought home who did not arrive with the right credentials visible. It had always worked, because the people he chose were either too exposed to move against him or too proud to move quietly. Lacey said, "He picked you because you came in a navy dress with no introduction. He didn't know anything about you except what you looked like across that table." She paused. "He never does the work of finding out first. He just decides." I listened to all of it without offering her anything in return. No reassurance, no shared outrage, no performance of being moved. I was moved. But Lacey had not come here for my reaction. She had come here because she needed to say it to the person it was said about, and that required a witness who would simply receive it. When she finished, she sat with her coffee, which had gone cold. She did not ask me what I was going to do. I think she understood that asking would change the nature of what she had just given me. It would make her complicit in a direction she had not chosen, and that was not why she came. She left just before noon. I walked her to the door and she paused on the step and said, "He has done this his whole life and nothing has ever come back to him." She said it without heat. She said it the way you state a weather pattern, not a complaint, just the condition of things as they have always been. I watched her walk to her car 2 houses down. I stood in the doorway until she drove away. Then I went inside, picked up my phone, and called Patrice. Patrice answered on the second ring. I told her one sentence. I told her that I wanted to begin the formal withdrawal process on the Hargrove Capital position in the Smith Company. The line was quiet long enough that I checked the phone to confirm she was still there. Then Patrice said, "How far do you want to take it?" Patrice's office is on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree that has no signage on the door, just a suite number and a small brass plate with the Hargrove name that most people walk past without registering. I have been coming here for 6 years. The receptionist knows my coffee order. The chair across from Patrice's desk holds the shape of a person who has sat in it many times, making decisions that required a room with no audience. I arrived at 7:45. Patrice was already at her desk. She had 2 legal pads, the original instrument, and a second folder she had prepared the night before without being asked. I looked at the folder. I did not ask her when she had found time to put it together because the answer did not matter. What mattered was that she had understood, from one sentence on a phone call the previous afternoon, exactly where this was going and what it would require. That is what 14 years of working together produces. Not loyalty as sentiment, loyalty as precision. I sat down. She opened the folder. We worked for just over an hour, not in the language of grievance, not in the language of retaliation, but in the language of contractual execution. The covenant breach clause was clear. The withdrawal right was clean. The 90-day notice period was unambiguous. Patrice walked me through the current position one final time. The Smith Company was not collapsing. That mattered. What mattered equally was that they were no longer as insulated as they had once been. The refinancing attempt 4 years earlier had told me that. The lender relationships were stronger than they looked from the outside and weaker than they appeared in public. The Hargrove position had provided stability for 14 years. Stability has a way of becoming invisible to the people standing on it. What we were doing had always been available to us. We were simply choosing to do it now. The formal withdrawal notice went out at 9:17 through registered legal correspondence, addressed to the Smith Company's Board of Directors, filed under the W.D. Hargrove Capital name, not to Sterling Smith personally. To the board, through proper channels, the way every significant financial communication in this relationship had always moved. There was no letter attached explaining the reason. The covenant language explained itself. Patrice set her pen down when it was done. She did not say anything, and neither did I. There was nothing that needed to be said. We had done the work carefully, and the work was complete. I drove home just after 9:30 through morning traffic that had thinned to the steady mid-morning pace of a city that has already sent its urgency out into the world. I changed clothes, made a proper lunch, not something quick, something that required attention, because I needed my hands occupied and my mind level. I ate at the kitchen table where 2 nights ago Harlan had slid a document toward me and told me the decision was mine. In the afternoon, I watched the news. Not for distraction, I watched it the way I watch most things, carefully, with the sound of something else running underneath. I did not check my phone. I was not anxious. I was waiting in the specific way of someone who has already done everything that needed doing and understands that what comes next is simply time moving at its own pace. The Smith Company's board would receive the correspondence today. Their legal team would review it today or tomorrow. Then it would go to their primary lender, because that was the sequence the covenant structure required. The lender would look at what the withdrawal triggered. Then the calls would begin. I knew the shape of what was coming. I just did not know its timing. I turned off the television at 6, made tea, sat by the window while the Atlanta evening came in low and orange over the rooftops. At 8:14, my phone lit up on the side table. A text from Patrice. 4 words and a period. First call came in. I read it twice. Then the second message arrived beneath it, 3 seconds later. They don't know the name yet. I set the phone face down on the side table and finished my tea. 3 days after the notice went out, Patrice called me at 8:30 in the morning while I was deadheading the roses along my back fence. I tucked the phone against my shoulder and kept working while she talked. The Smith Company's primary lender had flagged the withdrawal within 48 hours. The covenant clause had done exactly what Wendell designed it to do. It had not merely announced a departure, it had triggered a review condition that the lender was now contractually required to act on. Their auditors had been called in. The board had convened informally, which meant without Sterling present, which meant they were already separating their exposure from his. Sterling was making calls. Patrice had this from 2 directions. Their legal correspondence had begun arriving with a new urgency in its language, and a contact in the building that housed their primary counsel had noted the volume of activity coming out of that office. He was calling lawyers. He was calling contacts. He was pulling at every thread he could find attached to the name Hargrove Capital, looking for a face. He had not found one. I finished the roses and went inside to wash my hands. The days that followed had the same shape as any other week from the outside. I attended my garden club on Wednesday morning. 6 women in Adrian Colby's sunroom with coffee and a disagreement about the fall planting schedule that had been running pleasantly for 3 years. I had lunch with a friend on Thursday. I came home each afternoon and read. I did not discuss Hargrove Capital in any room that was not Patrice's office. I did not discuss it with Harlan, who had kept his word and not raised it since the kitchen table. I did not discuss it at all. What I was doing was not silence born of secrecy. It was silence born of understanding that a thing moving correctly does not need to be narrated. On Friday afternoon, Patrice mentioned Crawford. He was a board member, had been for 11 years, and he had known Wendell in the way that men who move in serious financial circles know each other. Not closely, but with the particular mutual respect of people who have watched each other work from a distance and formed a quiet opinion. Crawford had been asking, through careful channels, which legal firm represented the Hargrove Capital position. He was not asking on Sterling's behalf. Patrice was certain of that. He was asking for himself, trying to understand the shape of what had entered the room before he decided how to position himself relative to it. I noted that and said nothing beyond noting it. That evening, I made dinner, ate at the kitchen table, and read until 10. My phone stayed quiet. I had learned in the years since Wendell died that most situations resolve themselves more cleanly when you give them the space to develop without interference. You do the correct thing, through the correct channels, and then you wait with your hands open rather than reaching. Saturday morning, Patrice called again. Her voice had a different quality than the Friday calls. Not alarmed, but precise in the way she gets precise when something requires my full attention rather than my general awareness. She said Sterling had hired an investigator, not a law firm making formal inquiries, a private investigator tasked specifically with tracing the Hargrove holding structure back to a human name and a physical address. She said, "He is moving faster than I expected." I looked out the kitchen window at the roses I had trimmed 3 days ago, already reaching again. I said, "How long do we have before the structure becomes difficult to hold?" Patrice answered my question from Saturday with a meeting on Monday. Same office, same chair, same brass plate on the door that nobody reads. She laid out what the investigator would find when he traced the Hargrove structure, and she did it the way she does everything, without drama, in sequence, so I could see the shape of it clearly. A Delaware LLC registered 14 years ago. Managing member listed as a trust administrator whose name appears in no public record connected to Atlanta or to the Pickett family. Registered agent address on a legal services street in Wilmington that handles hundreds of similar entities. The trail was clean because Wendell had built it clean, not to hide, but because he understood that privacy and secrecy are different things, and only one of them requires a guilty conscience. The investigator would find the wall. He would know there was a wall. He would not get through it. I listened to Patrice walk me through each layer, and I felt something I recognized from the 4 years I had spent managing this position alone. A particular steadiness that comes not from certainty about outcomes, but from certainty about preparation. Whatever Sterling Smith was looking for, we had already considered the possibility of him looking. I drove home and spent the afternoon in the garden. By Wednesday, Patrice confirmed the investigator had filed his findings. Delaware LLC, Trust Administrator, Atlanta Agent Address. No individual name, no Pickett connection visible anywhere in the chain. Sterling had paid for a wall and received a detailed description of its surface. What neither Patrice nor I had anticipated was the lateral move. Sterling did not stop at the legal structure. A man who uses every room available to him does not restrict himself to formal channels when formal channels produce nothing. He went sideways, into the professional circle around Harlan, not through Harlan directly. Through a colleague at Harlan's firm, a man named Devlin, who handled mid-market transactions and had no reason to suspect the inquiry was anything other than routine background interest. Sterling had contacted him under the cover of due diligence. Vague language about familial connections to certain investment vehicles, the kind of phrasing that sounds like paperwork and moves like something else entirely. He was not yet connecting Hargrove to Pickett. He was simply pulling every thread within reach of the engagement, hoping one of them led somewhere. What he did learn was smaller than the answer he wanted and more useful than he realized. The investigator had confirmed that Harlan Pickett was not simply a fiancé. He was a corporate attorney with regular exposure to complex transactions, trust structures, and private capital arrangements. Nothing improper, nothing hidden, public information, but enough to alter the direction of the search. For the first time, Sterling stopped looking for an offended mother and started looking at the family itself. That was the thing about a man who had spent his career diminishing people before they could position themselves. He assumed everyone operated from the same instinct. He was looking for a wounded party making a clumsy move. He had not yet considered that the person across from him had been playing this game since before he knew the game existed. I was in the kitchen when Harlan called. Late afternoon, the light coming through the window at the low angle that means the day is almost done. His voice was steady, tight underneath the steady, the way a structure is tight. Not strained, controlled. He said, "He called my colleague today, Mama." I set down what I was holding. Devlin. Asked him about investment vehicles. Connected to our family. General language, but specific direction. A pause. "He still doesn't know it's you. The Hargrove wall held." I said, But he's looking at our name now." Another pause, shorter. And he knows enough to realize this isn't somebody acting out of hurt feelings. He's looking for a connection he can't see. I stood in the kitchen in the low afternoon light and considered that for a moment. Not with alarm, with the careful attention you give to something that has just changed its shape without changing its direction. Sterling Smith was getting closer. He was still looking for a wounded party. He had not yet understood what he was actually looking for. Lacey called on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the notice went out. She did not open with small talk, which told me the call had a specific purpose she had been organizing herself toward before she dialed. She said, "I need to tell you something about my mother." I sat down. What Lacey described was not a woman in crisis. It was a woman in motion, quiet, deliberate motion, of the kind that does not announce itself because announcement would defeat the purpose. In the past week, Celine Smith had made 2 separate appointments that Sterling did not know about. A private family attorney whose office was in Midtown, far enough from their usual professional circles that the choice itself was a message about discretion. And a financial advisor, not the one the Smiths used jointly, a different one entirely, whom Celine had seen alone on a Tuesday afternoon while Sterling was in a board meeting managing the fallout from the withdrawal. She was not panicking. Lacey was clear about that. Her mother did not panic. It was one of the few things Lacey had always respected about her. What Celine was doing was preparing for the version of this story that did not end in recovery. She was reading the situation the way a navigator reads weather, not to stop the storm, but to know which direction to turn before it arrived. Lacey said, "She's been like this before. When things get bad, she goes very quiet and very organized. It took me years to understand that the quiet is not calm, it's calculation." Then she told me something else. 3 days earlier, Celine had gone to the bank alone. Not one of the business accounts. Not anything connected to the company. Personal records, documents, copies of statements going back several years. Lacey did not know exactly what her mother had requested. Only that she had come home carrying a folder she placed immediately in her study and locked away. I listened to that and thought about the woman I had watched at the dinner table, the wine glass she held without drinking from, the eyes that moved across her husband, the way you watch something you have long since stopped trusting. Celine had been performing the marriage the way Sterling performed the wealth, consistently, skillfully, and with the private knowledge that performance is not the same as substance. The difference between them, Lacey said, was that Sterling needed people to believe it. Celine had simply learned to maintain it. Those are not the same need, and they do not produce the same response when the structure begins to fail. The Smith wealth had required constant maintenance because it had never been as solid as it appeared. Lacey had understood this in pieces over the years. A comment here, a tension there, the particular strain that appears in households where the image costs more than the reality can comfortably support. The Hargrove withdrawal had not created the fragility. It had simply made the fragility visible. I asked Lacey how Sterling was moving through the house. She said, loud, certain, like a man who believes the problem is external. A pause. My mother moves through it like she's already somewhere else. After Lacey finished, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment without speaking. Then I asked if she had been home this week. She said she had gone by on Wednesday to collect some things she had left there. I asked how her mother seemed. Lacey was quiet for a beat, the specific quiet of someone choosing between the short answer and the true one. She said her mother had been in the kitchen when she arrived, that Celine had looked up from what she was doing, studied Lacey's face for a moment, and then said, without any particular weight in her voice, "The way you say something you have already decided is true. The dinner is where it started, isn't it?" It was not a question. Then, according to Lacey, Celine had done something unusual. She nodded once to herself, not to Lacey, to herself. As though a calculation she had been working through privately had finally produced an answer. I held the phone against my ear and did not respond immediately. Outside the window, Atlanta had gone dark and quiet. Celine Smith had not found the name, but she had found the origin. And in my experience, a woman who finds the origin is usually much closer to the truth than anyone around her realizes. Patrice called on a Friday morning while I was at my kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper I still have delivered because Wendell started the subscription 30 years ago and I have never seen a reason to stop it. She said, "Crawford called the office yesterday afternoon." I set the newspaper down. Crawford had not called Sterling after the emergency board session. He had called Patrice's office, the registered legal contact for Hargrove Capital, the number that appears on the original instrument under correspondence protocol. He had the number because the instrument required one party to have it. He had apparently kept it for 11 years without using it, which told me something about the kind of man he was. Someone who files information carefully and retrieves it only when the moment justifies the reach. Patrice said the board had convened 3 days prior. The Hargrove withdrawal had triggered a liquidity review that the board could not defer or manage quietly. The covenant clause had done what Wendell designed it to do. It had not merely removed capital, it had restructured the company's entire risk position in the eyes of every financial relationship they held. The board was now formally exploring a sale of 70% of the company to a qualified buyer, not because they wanted to, because the alternative was a controlled collapse that would cost everyone at that table significantly more than a structured sale would. Crawford had called Patrice's office and asked for the registered representative of the Hargrove Capital position. When Patrice identified herself, he had been careful, not evasive, careful. There is a difference. He had said, without saying anything that crossed a line, that the board was open to a structured acquisition discussion with the right party. He had used the word qualified twice. He had not asked who was behind Hargrove. He had simply opened a door and described its dimensions. Patrice had thanked him, confirmed receipt of his communication, and told him she would convey the board's position to her principal. She delivered all of this to me in 4 minutes. Then she stopped and waited. I looked out the kitchen window. The roses along the back fence had come in fully now, the ones I had trimmed the morning the first call came in, 3 weeks ago. They do not know anything about what has been happening in this house. They simply grew because that is what they do when the conditions are right. I said, "What is the timeline Crawford is working with?" Patrice said the board had set an internal review deadline of 3 weeks. After that, the process would move to a broader search if no qualified party had engaged. 3 weeks was not generous. It was enough. I thought about Sterling Smith in that boardroom, loud and certain, the way Lacey had described him moving through the house, a man who believes the problem is external. I thought about him sitting at that table while his board discussed selling the company his father had built, the company he had inherited and maintained on capital he had never traced back to its source. I thought about Crawford making a call that was not to Sterling. I said, "Tell Crawford we are going to the table." Patrice said, "Which name do we walk in under?" The question was practical, and she knew I had already considered it. The name mattered. It determined the moment Sterling understood what he was sitting across from and how much time he had to compose himself before the room required something from him. I said, "Hargrove first." A pause. "And then Pickett." The line was quiet for exactly 1 second. Patrice said, "I'll call Crawford this afternoon." I picked up my newspaper. Outside, the roses held perfectly still in the morning air. The meeting was set for Tuesday at 10. By Saturday, I had done everything that needed doing and spent Sunday doing nothing at all, deliberately, the way you rest before something that requires your full self present and undivided. Monday, I prepared. I pulled the original instrument from the file drawer where it had lived for 14 years. The same drawer, the same manila folder, Wendell's handwriting on the tab. I did not read the whole document. I turned to the covenant clause and read it once, slowly. The way you read something not for information, but for grounding. I knew every word of it. Reading it again was not about the words. It was about remembering whose hands had written them and what those hands had understood about fairness, precision, and the long patience of people who build things correctly. I put the document back in the folder and the folder back in the drawer. Then I went to the closet in the spare room, the one with the garment bag hanging at the far left end, behind the winter coats, where I had placed it 18 months ago and not touched since. I unzipped it carefully. The suit inside was the color of good charcoal, Italian wool, cut with the kind of clean authority that does not announce itself. I had bought it alone, 14 months after Wendell passed, on a Tuesday afternoon when I walked into a store on Peachtree with no specific intention, and walked out with something I did not yet have an occasion for. Wendell never saw it. It was mine in a way that was distinct from the things we had chosen together, not better, different. Something I had selected for a version of myself that existed after him. I hung it on the bedroom door and looked at it for a while. I thought about Wendell, not with longing, which is the grief that faces backward, but with the particular gratitude that faces forward. He had built something real and taught me every part of it. He had never once suggested there were rooms I was not equipped to enter. When he was gone, I had sat in this house and been afraid for exactly 6 weeks, afraid of the documents, afraid of the decisions, afraid of the scale of what he had left in my hands. Then I had sat down at the kitchen table and begun reading. That fear had never returned. At noon, Patrice called. Not because anything had changed, because something hadn't. Crawford had reached out through the same careful channel he had been using since the board meeting. The acquisition discussion was proceeding. The room was set. Counsel was confirmed. But Sterling had spent the morning attempting to delay the meeting, not cancel it. Delay it. Additional review, additional consultation, additional time. Patrice said Crawford's response had been brief. The meeting would proceed as scheduled. I thanked her and hung up. That told me everything I needed to know. Confident men rarely ask for more time. I did not rehearse what I would say to Sterling Smith. There was nothing to rehearse because I had decided weeks ago to say almost nothing. A man who uses words as weapons expects you to arrive armed with the same. I was not bringing words. I was bringing the acquisition terms Patrice had drafted, the Hargrove instrument, and my own name on a sheet of paper beside his company's valuation. That was sufficient. I ironed the suit, made dinner, read until 9:30. At 10:15, my phone rang. Lacey. Her voice was steadier than I expected, which told me the conversation she was about to describe had already moved through its worst part before she called me. She had gone to the house that afternoon to tell her father she would not be coming back. She had kept it simple. No accusation, no catalog of grievances, just the decision stated plainly. She said Sterling had listened to the first 2 sentences and then stopped listening. His response had moved through no recognizable form of grief. It had gone directly to money, her dependence on his accounts, the car registered in his name, the arrangements he could discontinue. He had reached for financial control the moment emotional control left the room. Lacey said, "He didn't ask me to stay. He told me what I would lose." I sat with that for a moment. A man who responds to his daughter's leaving by listing her liabilities is not a man capable of understanding what he has done. He is only capable of understanding what things cost. Tomorrow, I would show him exactly what that cost. I was up at 5:45, which is when I am always up. I made the same breakfast I have made every weekday morning for 11 years. Oatmeal with 2 spoons of honey, black coffee, half a grapefruit. Wendell started me on grapefruit. I kept it after he was gone because some habits are not about the person who gave them to you. They are simply about who you have become. I dressed without hurrying. The charcoal suit, low heels in a shade that matched without matching exactly. The small pearl earrings I wear when I want to be taken seriously, without announcing that I want to be taken seriously. I looked at myself in the mirror the way I look at anything I have prepared carefully. Not for reassurance, for confirmation. I did not wear Wendell's watch. I had worn it to the dinner because I needed him present for something I did not know was coming. Today, I knew exactly what was coming. Today, I went in as myself alone. I left the house at 8:20. The drive to Midtown took 31 minutes in Tuesday morning traffic. I know this route, have driven it more times than I can count, and there is something steadying about a road your hands know without instruction. I parked in the building's underground garage at 8:51. I sat in the car for 4 minutes without checking anything, not from hesitation. From the understanding that stillness before a significant moment is not delay, it is arrival. I called Patrice at 8:55. She answered on the first ring. She said, "Everything is in order." Crawford confirmed the room at 9:45. Their counsel will be present. Ours is already upstairs. I said, "Good." She said, "Tressie." A pause with weight in it. "You have done everything correctly." I said, "I know." I got out of the car. In the elevator, I thought about 3 things, in this order. I thought about the handshake Sterling Smith had refused, the way he had looked at my extended hand with that brief, deliberate pause that was designed to establish a position before a word had been spoken. I thought about Lacey sitting on the edge of my sofa with cold coffee and 2 hands wrapped around a cup she had stopped drinking from, telling me a pattern she had carried alone for years. I thought about Harlan's face at that dinner table, not the anger of a son defending his mother, something older and more considered than anger. Recognition. He had known in that moment exactly what Sterling Smith did not know. He had known it, and he had stood up anyway, and said the only true thing in the room. The elevator opened on the 19th floor. A receptionist led me down a corridor with the particular carpeted quiet of serious buildings that take their own gravity as a given. She stopped at a set of double doors and opened the right one. I walked in. The room was long, well lit, an oval table with 8 chairs and water glasses already filled. Crawford was standing near the window. I knew him from a photograph Patrice had shown me, silver-haired, a careful posture. He nodded when I entered with the specific nod of a man acknowledging someone he has been expecting. Patrice's legal team was already seated on the left side, and at the far end of the table, already in his chair, already arranged in the posture of a man who arrives early to establish ownership of a room. Sterling Smith looked up. The moment he saw my face, something moved across his. Not shock, exactly. Something that arrives before shock, the fractional second when a mind presents information the rest of the self is not yet prepared to receive. I had seen that expression once before. 11 years ago, across a hospital bed, on a man who had just understood something that changed every calculation he had made. I walked to my chair and sat down. Crawford opened the meeting at 10:03. He did it with the practiced efficiency of a man who has run enough difficult rooms to know that ceremony only extends discomfort. A brief introduction of parties, a confirmation that all counsel was present, and then a nod to Patrice's lead attorney, a woman named Aldridge, who had been doing this work for 22 years and carried that fact in every syllable she produced. I sat at the left side of the table, 3 seats from Crawford, directly across from Sterling Smith's position. I folded my hands on the table in front of me, and I did not speak. Aldridge presented the Hargrove position cleanly, the original instrument, the 14-year history, the covenant clause and its activation, the withdrawal notice, and its legal standing. She did not editorialize. She presented the architecture of what existed and let the architecture speak for itself. That was what I had asked her to do, and she did it without ornamentation. Sterling listened for approximately 6 minutes before he tried the first redirect. It came as a question framed as clarification. Something about the timing of the withdrawal relative to a board decision made in the prior quarter, delivered in the easy, authoritative tone of a man who has used procedural language to slow rooms before. Crawford's expression did not change. Aldridge answered the question directly and continued. The room did not move in Sterling's direction. He waited 4 minutes and tried again. Quieter this time, the authority less procedural and more personal. The register of a man reminding the room that he belonged at its center. He addressed Crawford directly, used his first name, referenced a history between them that was real but was being deployed as leverage. Crawford received it with a courtesy that contained no yielding. Aldridge continued. The room did not move. I watched Sterling across the table, during all of this the way I watch most things, without expression, without signal, with the full and patient attention of someone who has already decided and is simply present for what follows. He had looked at me when I entered and then looked away, and then looked back twice in the first 10 minutes with the specific quality of a man trying to place something he cannot locate in his memory. The placement happened at minute 14. Aldridge had just finished presenting the proposed acquisition terms, the 70% structure, the governance provisions, the transition framework, when Sterling looked at me with a different quality of attention than he had managed before, not the social assessment from the dinner table. Something that moved through several calculations in the space of 2 seconds and arrived somewhere it had not expected to land. His face did not change dramatically. A man like Sterling Smith has spent a career managing his face in rooms where managing it was the only currency he had left. But there is a stillness that is different from composure. Composure is chosen. This kind of stillness is what remains when choice temporarily leaves the body. He went very still in that way. His hands, which had been moving with small executive gestures throughout the presentation, stopped completely. I held his gaze for exactly as long as was necessary and then returned my attention to Aldridge. Crawford called a 15-minute recess at 10:41. The room shifted, chairs moving, water glasses lifted, the low sound of separate conversations beginning. I stayed in my seat. I did not reach for my phone. I looked at the acquisition terms in front of me and made one small notation in the margin that I had been considering since Saturday. Across the table, Sterling's attorney leaned in close and said something near his ear. Sterling was still for another moment. Then he turned and looked directly across the room at me. This time, he did not look away. Sterling's attorney crossed the room during the recess and asked, with careful professional courtesy, whether I would be willing to speak privately with his client before the meeting reconvened. No counsel present. 10 minutes. I looked at the man making the request. He was doing his job and doing it cleanly. I said yes. They put us in a smaller room off the corridor, a windowless space with a round table, 4 chairs, and a water carafe nobody touched. Sterling came in and closed the door himself. He sat across from me and took a moment before he began, which I noted. A man who needs a moment before he speaks in private is a man who has been rehearsing on the walk over. He started with the explanation, not an apology, an explanation. He said the dinner had not been what it appeared, that he had been under considerable pressure that evening. Board matters, lender concerns, problems that had already begun moving through the company before anyone at that table knew they existed. He said he had not been at his best. I listened without expression. He said the comment had come out wrong. Not that it was wrong. That it had come out wrong. There is a difference. Then he told me he came from a family that placed a great deal of importance on social signals and presentation. He said that sometimes he made assumptions too quickly, that he had spent most of his life reading rooms and making decisions in seconds, and that occasionally those judgments were imperfect. Occasionally. I listened to that too. He shifted in his chair. For the first time since he entered the room, I saw something I had not seen at the dinner table. Uncertainty. Not remorse, not humility. Uncertainty. The kind that arrives when a man discovers the room is operating according to rules he does not control. He looked down at the table, then back at me. I shouldn't have said it. There it was, the closest thing to ownership he had managed so far. Not because he suddenly understood what the words meant, because he finally understood what they had cost. He rubbed a thumb along the edge of the table. I was wrong about you. That sentence took more effort than the others. I could tell. Not because it was sincere, because it forced him to acknowledge an error in judgment. For a man like Sterling Smith, that was expensive. Then he arrived at the apology. The word sorry appeared twice, carefully placed, buffered by explanations and context and references to pressure. It was still the apology of a man trying to preserve as much of himself as possible while standing in a room where preservation was becoming difficult. There was no accountability in it. There was the shape of accountability, the outline, nothing more. When he finished, I let the silence sit for 4 full seconds. Then I opened the folder in front of me and placed the acquisition terms on the table between us. I walked him through each provision: the 70% structure, the governance framework, the transition terms, the valuation basis. My voice was even throughout, not cold, not warm, simply precise. The terms were fair, not generous, not punitive. Fair in the complete, unambiguous way that leaves no room for negotiation, because there is nothing to negotiate against. A man expecting retaliation has a response prepared for retaliation. A man expecting capitulation has a response prepared for that too. Fairness of this quality leaves a man with nothing to push against. He read through them twice. His attorney was not in the room, and I watched him work through the provisions without counsel, which meant I watched him understand each one at the speed of his own comprehension, rather than at the speed of someone else's translation. When he finished, he looked at me for a long moment, then back at the papers. He said, "These are reasonable." I said, "Yes." He nodded once. Not agreement, recognition. He said, "I'll confirm with my team after the recess." I said, "That's fine." He gathered the terms and squared them against the table edge in the particular way of a man performing composure for an audience of one. Then he looked up. He said, "Lacey." A pause. "Is there anything you can—" He stopped. Restarted. "She won't take my calls." I looked at him across that small table in that windowless room. I said, "Lacey is not mine to speak for." He waited for more. There was no more. That was the complete answer, and something in its completeness told him that his daughter had not come to me as a casualty seeking shelter. She had come as a woman making a decision. The color in his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the acquisition. Harlan called on a Wednesday evening, 4 days after the acquisition meeting. I was in the kitchen finishing dinner when the phone rang and his voice came through with the particular quality it carries when he is delivering something he has been holding carefully. Not protecting me from it. Protecting the weight of it until the right moment. He said, "Lacey wanted you to know some things. She asked me to tell you." I turned the stove down and sat. She was still marrying him. That was the first thing he said, and he said it without preamble because he understood I would want the foundation before the details. The date they had chosen was still the date. Nothing about the acquisition, nothing about the preceding weeks, had moved that. What had moved was everything else. Lacey had gone to her mother the previous Friday, not to the house, to a coffee shop in Virginia Highland that Celine had suggested, which told its own story about how the geography of that family was quietly redrawing itself. She had told Celine that she loved her, and that love was not the question. The question was whether she could continue presenting herself at a table where what had happened at that dinner was treated as a matter of no lasting consequence. She had not issued conditions. She had not constructed an ultimatum with deadlines and consequences attached. She had simply told Celine the truth of where she stood and left it there for her mother to hold. With Sterling, she had done something quieter still. She had stopped explaining her choices to him, stopped translating herself into a language she thought he might accept, stopped waiting at a door that opened only from his side. Harlan said she had described it as setting something down rather than walking away, a distinction that sounded small and was not small at all. The gallery showing was Thursday. Her own work, pieces she had been building across 2 years, in a rented studio she paid for herself, shown in a small space in Inman Park that a friend managed. No family money in any part of it. The announcement had gone out to a modest list and she had not sent it to her parents. Then Harlan told me something else. Celine had asked for the gallery address. Not from Lacey. From him. The request had come quietly the day before. No explanation attached. No discussion. Just the address written down and a thank you afterward. Harlan said, "I don't think she's told Sterling." I sat with that for a moment. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. A woman who spends years maintaining a structure often announces nothing when she finally begins stepping outside it. She simply starts making choices that no longer require permission. Harlan said, "She's not angry, Mama. She's just done negotiating with herself." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about what it costs a person to reach that place. Not the dramatic rupture that looks like strength from the outside, but the quiet, internal work of stopping the negotiation that has been running underneath everything for years. The negotiation that says, perhaps, if I present this differently, perhaps if I wait a little longer, perhaps if I reduce myself to the size that fits the space they've left for me. Lacey had been running that negotiation since long before the dinner. The dinner had simply made the cost of continuing it visible enough that she could no longer pretend not to see it. I understood that particular arithmetic. I had done my own version of it once, in the 6 weeks after Wendell died, when I sat in this house afraid of the documents in his file drawer. The moment I stopped negotiating with my own fear and simply opened the drawer, that was the moment the rest became possible. Lacey had opened the drawer. I was still sitting with that thought when my phone rang again. Not Harlan. A number I recognized but had not expected. Had not expected in this context, at this hour, in this chapter of things. Celine Smith. I answered. Her voice was composed in the way it is composed when composure is load-bearing rather than decorative. She said she was not calling about the acquisition. She said she was not calling about Sterling. Then she told me she had found something among her late father-in-law's papers 3 nights earlier, something he had kept for 14 years and never thrown away. A letter. Not a business document, not a financial record. A letter written by Sterling's father after one of the last serious disagreements they ever had. Celine said she found it folded inside a box of estate records and personal correspondence that had been stored untouched since his death. She almost set it aside with the rest. Then she read it. The letter was not about money. It was about character. According to Celine, her father-in-law had written that he was increasingly concerned by a habit he saw developing in his son. Not a business habit, a personal one. The habit of deciding a person's worth before learning who they were. The habit of treating people differently depending on what he believed they could do for him. The habit of mistaking status for substance. Celine said there were examples throughout the letter. Employees, business associates, family friends. The details were old, but the pattern was familiar enough that she had to stop reading twice. Then she went quiet. I waited. Finally, she said, "There was one sentence he underlined." I did not speak. She said, "He wrote, 'One day you'll underestimate the wrong person, and it will cost you something money can't repair.'" The kitchen seemed very still around me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Celine said something else. Something that settled into place so neatly it felt less like a revelation and more like the answer to a question that had been waiting for years. She said, "When he spoke to you that night, Tressie, I thought I was watching my husband." A pause. After I read that letter, I realized I was watching a warning his father gave him a long time ago. I looked toward the drawer where Wendell's papers had once frightened me. Celine drew a slow breath. Then she said, "There was something else in that letter. Something I think you should know before tomorrow." And for the first time since she called, I felt something shift. The acquisition closed on a Thursday. Patrice sent one text at 2:17 in the afternoon. It said, "Done." I read it at the kitchen table and set the phone face down the same way I had set it down the night the first call came in. The symmetry of that was not lost on me. Sterling Smith now operated under terms I had set, and Patrice had enforced through 6 weeks of clean, precise, legally unimpeachable work. The company would continue, restructured, stabilized, carrying new governance provisions that meant the next decision of consequence would require more than one man's certainty to execute. The Smiths would continue in whatever form their marriage and their family were currently negotiating between themselves. Celine's call the previous week had told me enough about that direction to understand it was already decided, even if not yet announced. The morning after that call, she had sent me a copy of the letter. I read it once, then again. It was exactly what she said it was. A father trying to warn a son, not about business, not about money, about character. The final paragraph stayed with me longest. Her father-in-law had written that success had convinced Sterling he could judge people quickly, that he had begun confusing position with worth, that one day he would underestimate somebody whose value could not be measured by the things he usually measured. The sentence Celine mentioned was underlined twice. One day, you'll underestimate the wrong person, and it will cost you something money can't repair. I folded the letter and put it away, not because it no longer mattered, because it no longer belonged to me. The lesson in it had already completed its work. I did not feel triumph. I want to be precise about that because triumph is loud, and what I felt was not loud. It was the specific quiet of a thing resolved, the same quiet that follows any long piece of work done correctly, when the last document is filed and the last signature is in place, and what remains is simply the truth of what was built. I went upstairs and opened the closet. Not the spare room with the charcoal suit, my own closet, the door I open every morning. I took the navy dress from its hanger, the good dress, the one I had worn to a dinner in Buckhead 6 weeks ago with Wendell's watch on my wrist and no knowledge of what the evening would cost. I laid it on the bed and looked at it for a moment. Then I put it on. I did not wear the watch. I had worn it that night for Wendell. Tonight I was going somewhere he would have simply smiled about, quietly, without making it large. And I did not need to carry him there. He was already in everything the evening represented. The gallery was in Inman Park, a narrow converted space on a street where the old Atlanta and the new Atlanta had reached a comfortable arrangement. I arrived just after 7. The room was modest and warm, perhaps 40 people, good light, the low sound of genuine conversation rather than performed appreciation. Lacey's work covered 3 walls. I had not seen it before, and I stood in the entrance for a moment, taking in the room before I moved. Near the center of the room, I spotted Celine. She saw me at nearly the same moment. Neither of us crossed immediately. She simply gave a small nod. Not dramatic, not secretive. The kind of acknowledgement exchanged between 2 women who understood something important had ended, and something else had begun. I returned the nod and continued walking. I found the painting near the back left wall. Large, abstract, built in layers of gray and deep blue with a quality of stillness at its center that reminded me of something I could not immediately name. I stood in front of it for a long time, long enough that the room moved around me and I did not move with it. I thought about the word uneducated. I thought about page 11 of an instrument I could recite from memory. I thought about a restructuring attempt I had stopped alone at a kitchen table with no counsel and no credential, and nothing but 14 years of careful attention to what I had been taught by a man who never once suggested I was not equal to any document he placed in front of me. I thought about 6 weeks of precise, quiet, legally grounded work that had rearranged the architecture of a company whose owner did not know my name until the moment it mattered most. Sterling Smith had reached for the most reducing word he knew. He had aimed it at a woman in a navy dress with no introduction. He had not known, could not have known, that the woman he set it to had been the most important person in his company's story for 14 years. A woman appeared beside me. She looked at the painting and then looked at me with the easy curiosity of someone in a room full of strangers. She said, "Do you know the artist?" I smiled, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and settled. I said, "She is about to be my daughter-in-law." Then I offered my hand. The woman took it immediately, warmly, naturally, the way decent people do. "My name is Tressie Pickett," I said, "and I am exactly who I am.